Berry Farm was a public housing project east of the Anacostia River in southeast DC, and to where all of the residents were given eviction notices. Few residents were expecting it, most were shocked, and no one was prepared to leave. The question is, what happened to Berry Farm? Southeast DC has always been given a bad reputation of poverty and violence, and that label stuck mainly because of who lived east of the river in Washington, D.C., African Americans. And the Berry Farm neighborhood fell victim to all three circumstances. This poor neighborhood had residents living in substandard and deteriorating houses because of neglect from the city. And the youngest members of the neighborhood began to have turf wars. The lack of jobs for the men, the lack of education, mental health awareness, and the explosion of drug use in the 1980s made this tight-knit, family-oriented neighborhood fall like dominoes. So the city finally decided to tear it all down. As reported in the Washington Informer by James Wright Jr., in 2013, the district government announced efforts through its New Communities initiatives to spruce up Berry Farm dwellings with an upgrade in its housing stock, with the promise that residents would be able to return with the completion of the work. Empower DC and Beatrice Belt's organization, the Berry Farm Tenant and Allies Association, have made it clear that they want Berry Farm dwellings to be a livable, vibrant community, but don't support forced replacement as a means of accomplishing that goal. In addition, the group initiated efforts of its own when it became clear that the district government had little active interest in preserving the community's history. From April 2018 to January 2019, hundreds of families moved out and relocated, while most were forced out with evictions because they were thinking DC would build in place, believing the renovations would happen around them and they would move into their new address in the completed building across the street. Residents were given vouchers to live elsewhere until the redevelopment was done. Empower DC, a progressive activist organization, helped tenants form the Berry Farm Tenant and Allies Association to make sure that the original Berry Farm dwelling tenants aren't evicted from their homes and are able to stay at the renovated complex. But in 2019, demolition began, and Empower DC and Berry Farm Tenant and Allies Association launched efforts to have Berry Farm declared a historic site by the district government, and it's been granted at the end of 2019. In 1867, the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, created Berry Farm, a post-Civil War community of formerly enslaved and free people. The Bureau purchased the land from David and Julia Berry, white landowners, who were the heirs of James Berry. Berry Farm gets its name from the estate of James Berry. Berry bought the land from a section of land called St. Elizabeth's. Berry bought the land in hopes of making a profit from it as DC expanded east. Another section of that land already had a federally operated hospital for the insane built on it in 1855. Berry Farm was established in 1867 as the first African American home ownership community in DC. But over time, the original 375-acre site dwindled in size, and in 1942, the Alley Dwelling Housing Authority acquired 24 acres of that land and built what is known as the Berry Farm Public Housing Project. According to Wikipedia, Berry Farm was initially a large homestead stretching all the way to 13th Street on the east, Poplar Point on the west, and the present-day Morris Road on the north. Railroad tracks were laid in 1913 and cut off Berry Farm from Poplar Point, and now it's enclosed by the Anacostia Freeway and Suitland Parkway, further isolating the neighborhood more. And now Berry Farm has been reduced down to 3 lots of public housing, now demolished. Many residents came from the alley slums in Georgetown and Washington City, the only places where they can find to live in freedom. By 1870, more than 500 families had made Berry Farm their home and started a community. Families worked in the city by day and built their homes by night across the river from the Navy Yard. And according to the Anacostia Museum, in 1874, Berry Farm was renamed Hillsdale through a resolution introduced by Solomon G. Brown and passed by city officials. The name change was part of a larger movement to give Berry Farm a new start and led to increased civic participation, such as the establishment of the Hillsdale Civic Association. In this era, the community was thought of as a group of well-to-do black people because they were homeowners in a self-contained neighborhood where the residents demanded basic utilities. And then they built their own schools, churches, and civic organizations. By 1868, most of Berry Farm's 359 one-acre lots were already sold. Within 2 years, 266 families had already moved onto the site. As described by historian Louise Daniel Hutchison, she says many families made their way to Anacostia after working downtown all day and then built their homes by candlelight at night. Because many whites didn't want to see a community of black landowners established, some black people lost their jobs, while others were attacked on their way to their new homes. The growing community band together to further clear the land and to cultivate the gardens and fruit trees and tend to raising livestock. Berry Farm's wide streets were named after anti-slavery legislators, men who the residents felt were instrumental in the advancement of rights for black Americans during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania inspired Stevens Road. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts inspired Sumner Road. Senator Benjamin Wade from Ohio inspired Wade Road, as well as the Freedmen Bureau's administrator, John Eaton, inspired Eaton Road. And another official of the Freedmen Bureau was General Oliver Otis Howard, the founder of Howard University, a historical black college, also inspired the name of Howard Road. And today we have the Salvation Army building named for Solomon G. Brown. Born in 1829 to free black parents, Brown was a resident of Berry Farm. Solomon G. Brown made history in 1852 because he was the first black person to work at the Smithsonian Institute, and he remained the only black employee for many years. In later years, Brown was elected to the D.C. House of Delegates and was instrumental in changing the Berry Farm neighborhood name into Hillsdale. Historically, the earliest residents of Berry Farm named the new settlement Potomac City, although it's still commonly referred to as Berry's Farm or Berry Farms as it's called today, even when the area was officially renamed Hillsdale because of the hilly terrain. The residents had to cut through and level layers of trees and brush on very steep hills just to build their own houses. World War II brought a new population to Berry Farm, laborers for the war effort. War housing projects were set up all across the city, but most notably was Berry Farms. But with the opening of Suitland Parkway in 1944 to connect the Navy's Anacostia Air Station and the Army's bowling field to Camp Springs Army Airfield, now known as Andrews Air Force Base, these military bases basically broke up Berry Farm by reducing it in size. Originally, the 9-mile highway was for military use only, with the intent of moving traffic between the military bases. And this highway broke Berry Farm in half. In 1941, the government considered a section of Berry Farm where 23 families lived unfit, so the government tore it down by forcing them out in order to build the Berry Farm dwellings. These homeowners were uprooted through eminent domain. Millions of people migrated across the country because of World War II related employment, but most public housing was built for white residents only. DC's black population grew by more than 30% during a time when black people were banned from living in most of the city and the surrounding suburbs, then suffering a severe housing shortage during World War II. DC's housing authority tore down a lot of black-occupied housing in neighborhoods west of the Anacostia, around Capitol Hill, and downtown. In the 1940s, Ulysses S. Grant explicitly called for African Americans to be resettled in remote areas out of the way. And Anacostia was a semi-rural area with large tracts of open land. The housing authority faced resistance for construction of public housing, especially for African Americans, whose presence was said to devalue the land and could be potentially subdivided for later sale to white residents. White homeowners fought against African Americans living in proximity to white neighborhoods. And this caused the housing authority to settle on sites like Berry Farm, a place where black people had already lived for nearly a century. With the initial priority given to families involved in war-related jobs, families started moving into the new Berry Farm dwellings in 1942. Families who had lived in a government trailer park after being forced to vacate their homes because of the Navy Yard expansion were among the first to move in. Berry Farms was one of 3 public housing projects where families moved to after being displaced for the construction of Suitland Parkway. In 2012, DC announces its plans to demolish Berry Farms for a new higher density neighborhood, from 442 homes to over 1,100. A statement from the mayor's office said that redevelopment will preserve public housing and provide new affordable housing. The redevelopment will also include roads, a central park, retail space, and a community center. And the retail businesses will include a grocery store, restaurants, and a daycare. But so far, work has stopped. But why? The multiple reasons why the project hasn't continued include meetings, court decisions, appeals, audits, and questions of affordability for the returning residents, just to name a few. But what has been completed? Well, so far the developer claims to have relocated the utilities and installing water and sewer systems. But one major accomplishment has been completed, and that is naming the remaining homes on Stevens Road as declared historic, and the possibility of turning those houses into a museum. The Washington Post reported that DC has the highest intensity of gentrification of any U.S. city, according to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And more than 20,000 African Americans were displaced in DC from year 2000 to 2013. Affluent white newcomers are taking their place as affordable housing grows scarce. So I was out taking pictures of Berry Farms. I walked around on a very nice, crisp winter's day, and went past the old picnic area. A piece of a grill looked like it was still there, and next to it was an old basketball court. A lot of weeds and grass grew in places where they shouldn't have grown. But I noticed out in the distance there, clearly over I-295, you could see the Frederick Douglass Bridge. I think it's been reopened. I don't think it's been a year yet. Big pretty sight, but looking at 295 on the ground level looked kind of weird, especially with all the buildings knocked down. But right in that same area, they built the new Berry Farm Rec Center. And right behind that rec center is when I ran into a bunch of guys standing out in the parking lot, drinking, smoking, and playing loud music, dancing, having a good time. So, you know what I had to do? I had to go talk to somebody. So, I went and I approached the fellas. Hey fellas, what y'all doing out here? So they smiled at me. They were grinning, dancing, drinking. I saw cases of beer. It was cold outside, so there's no need for a cooler and ice. But everybody had a cup with something they were drinking out of it, and one guy had like a small miniature grill by his car. So he sat on the curb and he worked his little grill, and they all had hot dogs standing outside on the parking lot on the side of the rec center. So I approached one guy and I started asking questions. I just yelled out to the group, to everybody, and caught everybody's attention. And I said, how do y'all feel about the new Berry Farms? One guy just looked at me and shrugged his shoulders. He didn't say anything. But another guy did say something, and he said, hey baby, they ain't bringing it back. They basically kicked us out for nothing. So then I asked everybody, and I yelled it loudly, so do everybody here plan on coming back when they rebuild it? And everybody said no. But one old guy, he did turn around and approached me, and he said, look, baby girl, that's not my home over there anymore. Then he pointed to the empty field right behind the fence. Then he turned back around and pointed behind him and said, this is my home now, pointing to all the men drinking and eating and dancing. So I asked one of the younger guys who went to go pull a beer from the case of beer, I asked that guy, do all y'all usually hang out here looking at the empty field of Berry Farm? And he said, oh no, I'm just hanging out with them. I eat and drink whatever they got, but they can answer your questions. So then I turned to an older guy who had a drink in his hand and I asked the older guy, do y'all come out here all the time? This old guy was in the middle of dancing, had a drink in his hand. He smiled at me, danced a little jig, but then what was funny, he did like a hard stop. You know, like he was emphasizing his answer. Then he looked at me and said, yep. And then he turned around and started dancing again. And then with that, all the other fellas started dancing, and they were pretending like we were dancing together, but we're at like a 10-foot distance. So I pretended like I was dancing with them. So I answered all of their questions. Why am I out here taking pictures? Then they answered my questions. Why are y'all out here in the cold grilling and drinking beer? And they said we were out here having a good time, and this is where we used to live at, but we've come back to reminisce and just hang out. And I said, you know what? I ain't mad at you. So we said our goodbyes. Old men blew me a kiss. Bye-bye. And I waved by, and about half of the fellas waved bye to me. So I left. I liked it. It was nice. And in doing my research for this video on Berry Farm, I was told to remind people that Berry Farm is not named after the former DC mayor, Marion Barry. And then actually, I didn't think anybody would believe that. The neighborhood itself is a century and a half old, and Marion Barry moved to DC in 1965. But I did find an old interview with Marion Barry admitting that when he moved to DC, he moved to Northwest DC, and he knew absolutely nothing about Southeast DC. And he also admitted that many young people was asking him about a neighborhood that he knew nothing about. He had to tell people, no, he did not own Berry Farm. And to add, I want to give mention to some famous men from Berry Farms. Escaped slave and author Frederick Douglass spent a little time in Berry Farms before he moved to Cedar Hill. The Frederick Douglass House is a famous landmark in Anacostia, D.C. But it's two of his sons that raised families in Berry Farm. Frederick Douglass Jr. was the second son and also an abolitionist. He was a newspaper editor and an army recruiter for black soldiers for the U.S. Union Army during the Civil War. Long after his death, his remains were moved to the Woodlawn Cemetery on Benning Road in Southeast D.C. And the go-go band called the Junkyard Band was formed in the 1980s by some kids on the playground making music with homemade instruments. Instruments made out of paint buckets and tin cans, and either using their hands or sticks to bang on the instruments to make music. And those kids grew up in Berry Farm. And before I end this video, I wanted to mention this weird street name. Who the heck is First Sterling Avenue named after? Well, I asked Mr. Google, and I found out that First Sterling was a steel plant that opened in 1907 but gone now, and used to be on the same plot of land where Bolin Air Force Base is now. First Sterling Avenue was parallel to the railroad tracks that used to run through there and gave access to the new bowling field that was being used by the Army. So First Sterling was an access road named after a steel plant. Thank you for hanging out with me. I'm Dickie D in DC, and I will see you in the next video.